Let me start with something most people get completely wrong. China isn't competing with the United States. China is outplanning the United States. And in a world where the real weapon is not missiles but supply chains, planning beats power. Every single time. Most people see tariffs. They see headlines about percentages rising and falling, trade delegations meeting in Geneva and Kuala Lumpur, temporary agreements promising relief that never quite materializes. They think this is a trade dispute, maybe a negotiation tactic, perhaps even a bargaining chip for other diplomatic concessions on Taiwan or the South China Sea. It isn't. This is the first stage of a long-term strategic collision that will define the entire century, reshape global commerce in ways we're only beginning to understand, redraw alliance structures that have existed since World War II, and ultimately determine which model of organizing human economic activity prevails in the interconnected world we've built over the last 75 years. Stay with me, because once you see how China plays the game and how America responds, you'll understand something deeply uncomfortable, something that doesn't fit neatly into campaign slogans or quarterly earnings calls or the simplified narratives we get from cable news. China's strategy is designed for 100 years. America's strategy is designed for the next election cycle. And there's one moment in this geopolitical chess match where China quietly pulled a move so powerful, so strategically brilliant, that Washington didn't even realize what had happened. Not immediately, not for months, maybe not even now. It wasn't announced with fanfare at a Communist Party Congress. There were no press conferences with dramatic proclamations from Beijing. No Western analysts saw it coming. It happened slowly, methodically, over decades of patient positioning while America was distracted by wars in the Middle East and financial crises at home. We'll get to that specific moment. But first, you need to understand the board, because the pieces aren't what you think they are. The players aren't following the rules you learned, and the game itself has changed in ways most analysts, most politicians, most economists still don't fully grasp. Geopolitics today isn't diplomacy in the traditional sense. It's not ambassadors in tailored suits exchanging carefully worded communiques over coffee. It's not leaders shaking hands for photo opportunities at summit meetings. It's engineering on a global scale. Supply chains that stretch across oceans and continents. Rare minerals buried deep in mountains that most people have never heard of. Manufacturing nodes concentrated in specific cities. Shipping lanes controlled by whoever has the naval power to secure them. Semiconductor fabs that cost $20 billion each to build. Refining capacity for materials that every piece of modern technology depends on. Logistics networks so complex that disrupting one node can cascade through the entire system. These are the real weapons of the 21st century. The actual instruments of power that determine who can build what, when they can build it, and at what cost. Think of the world economy as a giant machine, an impossibly complex apparatus with millions of moving parts, all interdependent, all vulnerable to disruption at critical junctures where everything flows through a single choke point. Whoever controls the parts, whoever sits at those choke points where components must pass, whoever can throttle or accelerate the flow of essential materials, they control the future. They control what gets built, what technologies advance, what nations can defend themselves, what economies can grow. For years, decades really, the US and China operated like two companies in a complicated joint venture, two entities who fundamentally didn't trust each other, who competed fiercely in some domains, who viewed each other with suspicion and often outright hostility, but who made too much money together, generated too much mutual benefit, created too much interdependence to seriously consider walking away from the relationship. American consumers got inexpensive goods that kept inflation low and living standards high. Chinese factories got steady orders that employed hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. American companies got access to a massive and growing market of over 1 billion potential customers. Chinese firms got technology transfer, investment capital, management expertise, and integration into global supply chains. It was mutually beneficial, even if mutually distrustful. That era? Over. Finished. We're no longer in negotiation mode, no longer in the phase where both sides believe that deeper integration serves mutual interests and that economic ties will naturally lead to political convergence. We're in economic conflict mode, in a competition where both nations are actively, deliberately trying to reduce dependencies, build parallel systems, create redundancy even at significant cost, and position themselves for a future where the other might be an adversary rather than a partner. America's response to this new reality? Fast, loud, aggressive, political. Tariffs on nearly everything. Rates that climbed from 10% to 25% to 50% to 84%, and at certain points even higher, creating layers of stacked duties that pushed effective tariff rates to levels not seen since the 1930s. Even bizarre symbolic moves that seemed more about generating headlines than achieving strategic objectives, like threatening restrictions on Chinese cooking oil imports, like imposing port fees disguised as global adjustments that targeted vessels linked to Chinese shipping networks, like announcing reviews of products that represented tiny fractions of trade volume but generated maximum media attention and political points. Talk of cutting off entire categories of goods, weaponizing access to American markets, using economic pressure to force behavioral changes in Beijing on everything from Xinjiang to the South China Sea to technology transfer. This is poker. Short-term bluffs, fast pressure, high volatility, moves designed to create maximum uncertainty and force the other player to fold or make immediate concessions. And politically? It works brilliantly in the short term. Markets react instantly when a president announces new tariffs via social media at 7 in the morning. Headlines amplify the pressure, creating domestic political wins and satisfying constituencies who felt economically left behind by globalization and want to see their government taking visible, aggressive action. Traders scramble to adjust positions. Supply chain managers panic about disruptions. CEOs call their lobbyists, demanding meetings with Congress. The system responds. The machine reacts. But poker has one fatal fundamental weakness. It assumes the other player is playing the same game, operating under the same time horizons, responding to the same incentives, caring about the same metrics, measuring success the same way. China isn't. China doesn't play poker. China plays chess. Slow, deliberate, methodical, patient. 10 moves ahead, sometimes 20, thinking in terms of decades rather than quarters, in terms of structural positioning rather than immediate tactical gains. Beijing's counterattack wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no emergency sessions of the Politburo Standing Committee broadcast to the world. It was surgical, precise, calculated, and designed not just to inflict economic pain, but to send specific messages to specific audiences, to demonstrate resolve without escalating beyond control, to show strength while maintaining optionality. Hit U.S. farmers by stopping soybean purchases, drying up a market that American agriculture had depended on for decades. Not random, but targeted directly at swing states like Iowa and Wisconsin, at constituencies that matter disproportionately in American elections, at sectors where senators and representatives would feel immediate, intense pressure from their most important voters. Sanction shipping companies that handle American goods, impose port fees on U.S.-linked vessels that suddenly make certain trade routes less profitable. Slow down customs clearance for American products so they sit in warehouses accruing costs while Chinese competitors get expedited processing. Launch antitrust investigations into American tech firms operating in China, creating legal uncertainty and financial risk. Designate U.S. companies as unreliable entities, subject to special scrutiny and potential restrictions. Each move carefully calculated. Each strike designed not just to inflict pain, but to send specific messages to specific audiences. And then came the masterstroke, the move that changed the entire calculus of the conflict. The quiet weapon that most people still don't fully appreciate. Rare earth minerals. Your phone. Your electric vehicle. Your missile defense systems. Your satellites orbiting overhead. Your wind turbines generating clean energy. Your advanced medical equipment saving lives in hospitals. Even the device you're watching this on right now, they all depend on rare earth elements, a group of 17 metallic elements with unique magnetic, luminescent, and electrochemical properties that make modern technology possible. Here's what nobody talks about, what gets buried in technical reports that policymakers don't read. The minerals themselves aren't actually rare in the geological sense. They exist in deposits all over the world, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in various African nations, in Southeast Asia, in Greenland, in dozens of locations where surveys have identified commercially viable quantities. What's rare, what's highly concentrated, what represents the actual bottleneck isn't the minerals themselves, but refining capability, the industrial capacity to take raw ore out of the ground and process it through complex, multi-stage chemical procedures into the purified compounds that manufacturers actually need. That's the choke point. That's where the vulnerability lies. The US used to dominate this field completely. America used to have significant domestic refining capacity, used to process rare earths extracted from American mines in American facilities, employing American workers. But refining is dirty, toxic, environmentally brutal. It generates enormous quantities of hazardous waste that has to be disposed of safely. It requires energy-intensive chemical processes that consume vast amounts of electricity. It creates contamination problems that communities understandably don't want anywhere near their homes or schools or water supplies. Environmental regulations tightened through the 1990s and 2000s. Operating costs increased dramatically. Public opposition grew as communities became more environmentally conscious. Companies faced expensive cleanup requirements and liability concerns. So America, like many developed nations making similar calculations, stepped out of the messy, polluting middle of the supply chain, choosing to import refined, rare earths rather than deal with the pollution, the expense, the political headaches, the regulatory complexity of processing them domestically. It made economic sense at the time. Why bear those costs when you could buy the refined product cheaply from overseas? China stepped in. Slowly, patiently, without fanfare or geopolitical declarations or any indication this was strategic rather than purely economic. For decades, Chinese companies built refining capacity while Western firms were shutting theirs down. They absorbed the environmental costs that democracies weren't willing to accept. They accepted the pollution burden, often in regions far from major population centers, where political opposition would be minimal. They invested heavily in processing technology and chemical engineering expertise. They created massive economies of scale by concentrating production. They gradually, methodically, patiently captured the market. Now China controls somewhere between 70 and 80% of global rare earth refining capacity, sitting comfortably at the bottleneck the entire world depends on. This isn't leverage in the traditional diplomatic sense, not a bargaining chip you can trade for concessions in some other domain like intellectual property or market access. This is structural power, the kind of deep, foundational advantage that fundamentally reshapes how entire systems operate, the kind you cannot sanction away because there are no alternative suppliers to switch to at scale, cannot simply replace with alternative suppliers because building refining capacity takes years and billions of dollars, cannot work around with clever financial engineering or contractual arrangements, the kind you cannot replace in a year or 5, or even 10 without absolutely massive investment, technological development you can't rush, Sustained political will across multiple election cycles, and acceptance of environmental costs that democracies struggle to impose on their own populations. And when tensions reached their peak in 2025, when the tariff escalations hit their highest levels, and both sides were actively looking for pressure points where they could inflict maximum pain with minimal risk of uncontrolled escalation, China didn't threaten randomly or make vague pronouncements about potential future restrictions that might or might not be implemented. They acted. Tightened rare earth export controls. Implemented in October a comprehensive regulatory framework that included de minimis rules tracking even tiny quantities of Chinese-origin rare earth materials incorporated into foreign manufactured products, foreign direct product rules extending Chinese jurisdiction to items made abroad using any Chinese rare earth technologies or processes, and explicit restrictions preventing Chinese citizens and Chinese companies from providing technical assistance to overseas rare earth projects without obtaining explicit government licensing. That was the quiet move I mentioned at the beginning. The move that didn't generate front-page headlines for weeks because most journalists didn't understand its significance. The move Washington severely underestimated because it seemed like just another bureaucratic regulatory adjustment rather than a fundamental shift in the architecture of global supply chains. Though China later suspended implementation of these most stringent controls as part of broader trade negotiations and temporary de-escalation, the strategic message was sent loud and clear. The capability exists, the legal and regulatory framework is ready and tested, and the choke point can be activated whenever strategic circumstances require it. And here's what nobody saw coming, what caught Washington completely off guard. While American officials celebrated the suspension as a diplomatic victory, as evidence that pressure tactics were working and China was backing down, China had already won the deeper game. They demonstrated beyond any doubt that the weapon exists and functions exactly as designed. They'd shown they're absolutely willing to use it when pushed. They'd proven that decades of patient infrastructure building, of accepting environmental costs that democracies rejected, of strategic investment while America was focused elsewhere, created leverage that tariffs cannot match and sanctions cannot eliminate. That's chess thinking. That's 100-year strategy playing out in real time. Now America is racing desperately to catch up, scrambling to rebuild capabilities that were allowed to atrophy over decades of outsourcing and offshoring. Reopening Mountain Pass, the major rare earth mining facility in California that has cycled through multiple bankruptcies and ownership changes. Building the Ambler Road in Alaska to access mineral deposits in remote regions where infrastructure has never existed and environmental challenges are immense. Pooling $1.5 trillion from major financial institutions, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, sovereign wealth funds from allied nations, to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, to fund expensive reshoring initiatives, to finance the construction of processing facilities that can handle the dirty, toxic work of rare earth refining that America abandoned a generation ago. Aligning diplomatically with Australia, with Canada, with European partners to create alternative supply chains, to build redundancy into systems that became dangerously concentrated, to diversify sourcing beyond China. These are smart moves, necessary moves. Exactly the kind of strategic infrastructure investment that should have happened years ago, that some analysts were warning about as far back as the 2000s. But they're all 5 to 10-year projects at absolute minimum. Massive capital expenditures requiring lengthy permitting processes, years of construction timelines, workforce development and training programs, technology transfer from the few remaining experts who still remember how this works, inevitable learning curves as facilities ramp up production and operational scaling to reach commercially viable volumes. In a world where China can shift policy overnight with a single directive from Beijing, where the Communist Party can issue a regulatory decree that reshapes global markets before American decision-makers even finish their morning coffee, that delay matters enormously. That gap creates acute vulnerability. That window of dependency is when economic leverage becomes geopolitical coercion. Here's the deeply uncomfortable truth that keeps strategists awake at night. China believes, rightly or wrongly, but with genuine conviction based on their analysis of American political economy, that America's real vulnerability isn't manufacturing capacity or even technological capability. It's confidence. The psychological and emotional foundations of a market-based system that depends fundamentally on belief, on expectations about the future, on the collective conviction that tomorrow will be better than today, and that any disruptions will be temporary rather than permanent. The US economy is profoundly, deeply tied to market psychology in ways that centrally planned command economies simply are not. One bad headline, one unexpected piece of negative economic data, one concerning statement from a Federal Reserve official, can shake the Dow Jones Industrial Average by hundreds of points within minutes. A few percentage points down in major indices triggers algorithmic selling programs, causes pension funds to automatically rebalance their portfolios towards safer assets, makes consumers feel subjectively poorer even if their actual income hasn't changed at all, creates negative feedback loops where fear of recession itself contributes to recession by reducing spending and investment. This isn't weakness in the traditional military or industrial sense. It's not a flaw that can be fixed with better policy or smarter leadership. It's a structural feature, an inherent characteristic of how democratic capitalism operates. Markets function as information processors, responding instantly to new data, continuously repricing assets based on evolving expectations about future growth and profitability. China knows this intimately from studying American economic history, and they've learned to weaponize volatility itself, creating uncertainty not because it immediately achieves some concrete diplomatic objective, but because it shakes confidence at a fundamental level, creates pervasive doubt about the future, makes investors hesitant to commit capital and consumers cautious about major purchases. Because if you can shake Wall Street, if you can introduce sustained volatility that makes capital allocation uncertain and long-term planning impossible, you can shake Washington. You can make policymakers desperate for stability, willing to make significant concessions just to restore calm, constrained by the overwhelming political imperative to prevent market crashes that destroy retirement savings and tank approval ratings. Look at the actual numbers underlying American consumption patterns. 50% of all US consumer spending, half of the entire consumption-driven economy, comes from just the top 10% of households by income. That concentrated demographic, those wealthy households whose spending literally drives half the economy, depends heavily on portfolio performance, on the value of their retirement accounts and investment holdings, on wealth effects created by rising asset prices in stocks and real estate. Their spending decisions aren't driven by paycheck-to-paycheck necessity the way middle-class and working-class spending is. They're driven by confidence about future wealth, about whether their net worth will be higher or lower in 5 years or 10 years when they plan to retire or send kids to college. If markets dip significantly, if their portfolios shrink even temporarily, if uncertainty creates fear about long-term financial security, consumption drops immediately among this crucial demographic. When the wealthiest households pull back spending, the entire economy feels it within weeks. Luxury goods sales decline, high-end services contract, discretionary purchases get postponed. All the categories that employ millions of people and generate substantial GDP, they contract in concert. Recession risk explodes not from fundamental economic weakness, not from productivity decline or structural problems, but purely from psychological shifts triggered by market movements and the fear those movements create. America is powerful, immensely powerful, still the largest economy on Earth with unmatched innovative capacity, and the deepest capital markets in human history. But fragile in specific places, vulnerable at particular joints where the system's greatest strengths paradoxically become exploitable weaknesses, where the very mechanisms that enable rapid growth and efficient resource allocation also enable rapid disruption and contagion. And diplomacy? The alliance structure that's supposed to be America's asymmetric advantage over China, the network of partnerships that should multiply American power. Here's the fundamental problem playing out in capitals from New Delhi to Brussels to Canberra. You're trying to win a geopolitical tournament with half your major pieces voluntarily left in the parking lot. The US desperately needs allies to effectively counter China's sheer scale, to create coalitions capable of matching Chinese manufacturing capacity and market size, to build truly alternative supply chains and competing technology standards, to present a genuinely unified front on regulatory approaches and security concerns. But America First policies, however popular domestically and understandable given legitimate economic grievances, systematically alienated precisely the key partners America most needs. They remember being called national security threats to justify steel and aluminum tariffs. They remember sudden tariff announcements made without any consultation or advance warning. They learned through bitter experience that agreements painstakingly negotiated by one American administration might be unilaterally torn up by the next. India, the natural demographic and geographic counterweight to China in Asia, the world's most populous democracy and a rapidly rising manufacturing power, fundamentally distrusts Washington's long-term reliability. Europe feels frustrated and abandoned, caught painfully between the world's two largest economies, forced to choose sides in an escalating conflict where both options carry substantial costs. Smaller nations see tactical unpredictability instead of consistent strategy, short-term moves instead of coherent long-term vision. Every diplomatic move becomes unnecessarily defensive, every negotiating position slightly weaker than it should be, every bargaining exchange less favorable than it might have been with full alliance coordination. Now to the battlefield where the future is actually being decided, where the outcome will shape technological development for generations. Semiconductors. If rare earths are the foundational materials enabling modern technology, semiconductors are literally its brain, the chips that process information and enable intelligence, whether artificial or human-directed. Everything in modern civilization depends on chips at a fundamental level. Artificial intelligence systems training on massive datasets to develop capabilities we're only beginning to understand. Cars with dozens of microprocessors controlling everything from engine performance to climate systems to entertainment. Rockets navigating through space with precision unimaginable a generation ago. Hospitals running sophisticated diagnostic equipment that can detect diseases earlier and treat them more effectively. Defense systems processing targeting data and coordinating complex operations. Financial networks executing billions of transactions instantaneously. Communications infrastructure routing signals globally. The entire architecture of modern technological civilization rests on tiny pieces of silicon etched with transistor patterns measured in nanometers, manufactured in incredibly complex facilities, costing upward of $20 billion each and requiring 5 to 7 years just to build and bring online. The US, watching China's unnervingly rapid technological rise, seeing Chinese AI companies suddenly competing directly with Silicon Valley's best, observing Chinese firms designing increasingly sophisticated chips that narrow the performance gap annually, made a strategic decision to slow China's advancement by tightly controlling access to cutting-edge semiconductor technology. Ban the machines that literally print the future. The Dutch-made extreme ultraviolet lithography systems manufactured by ASML that represent the only tools anywhere in the world capable of manufacturing the most advanced chips at 5 nanometers and below. Restrict sales of NVIDIA's high-performance AI chips to Chinese customers, directly limiting the computational power available to Chinese researchers and technology companies. Build comprehensive export control alliances with allies, creating multilateral restrictions preventing China from accessing advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment or sophisticated design tools from any Western source. Smart strategy if you're genuinely trying to maintain a decisive technological advantage. China answered with brute force execution, with exactly the kind of massive resource mobilization that only a highly directed economy can realistically achieve. Billions of dollars, likely hundreds of billions when you account for hidden subsidies and state-directed lending, poured systematically into domestic semiconductor development. Recruiting top talent aggressively from Taiwan, from South Korea, from the United States, offering compensation packages and research budgets that private companies struggled to match, building fabrication plants at a pace that astonishes outside observers, subsidizing companies generously through their inevitable learning curves, accepting extraordinarily high failure rates and significant waste because the overriding strategic imperative of technological self-sufficiency justifies almost any cost. Reverse engineering restricted technologies, painstakingly studying captured chips to understand manufacturing processes and design principles, recruiting employees from foreign semiconductor companies who possess the institutional knowledge and practical expertise, new fabrication facilities opening seemingly every year across multiple provinces, creating deliberately redundant capacity, fully accepting that much of this capacity will initially produce inferior chips at substantially higher costs, but building systematically toward a future when learning curves finally flatten and economies of scale emerge. They're behind, significantly behind in the most advanced nodes, unable currently to manufacture the smallest, fastest, most power-efficient processors representing the absolute cutting edge. For now, but remember SpaceX back in 2008? A scrappy startup rocket company competing against aerospace giants like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, against established players with literally decades of heritage and massive ongoing government support. Everyone knew SpaceX was behind. Everyone confidently expected them to stay behind. Everyone had perfectly rational, well-supported reasons explaining why a newcomer couldn't possibly catch up to incumbents with such overwhelming structural advantages. Then suddenly, through relentless iteration and willingness to fail publicly and learn rapidly from those failures, through radical vertical integration and unconventional engineering approaches that challenged industry orthodoxy, they weren't behind anymore. They were ahead. They were reliably landing orbital-class rockets, launching more total mass to orbit annually than the entire rest of the world combined. History absolutely does not guarantee China achieves a similar trajectory in semiconductors, but it powerfully suggests that confidently betting against highly motivated competitors with truly vast resources and genuinely patient capital willing to accept short-term losses for long-term strategic position is remarkably risky. If China does catch up on advanced chips, if Chinese companies successfully develop the full capability to manufacture cutting-edge semiconductors domestically without any dependence on Western equipment or Western-designed tools, the world splits permanently. Two completely separate chip ecosystems emerge. Two fundamentally incompatible technology stacks using different architectures and standards. Two internets that don't fully interconnect or share data seamlessly. Two artificial intelligence development paths that diverge substantially in underlying architecture and philosophical approach. Two telecommunications networks operating on incompatible protocols and unable to communicate reliably. Two separate industrial control systems that literally cannot talk to each other. Two parallel economic universes that still trade actively in physical goods but maintain rigorously separate digital infrastructures and technology platforms. And once that split happens, once both superpowers have invested hundreds of billions or multiple trillions in these parallel systems, once governments formally mandate that all critical infrastructure must use only domestic or explicitly allied technology, Once global supply chains fully bifurcate along geopolitical lines, reconnecting them becomes functionally impossible. The switching costs become economically prohibitive, running into trillions of dollars to replace installed systems. The security concerns become diplomatically insurmountable as neither side trusts the other's technology in sensitive applications. The massive installed base of fundamentally incompatible systems creates powerful lock-in effects lasting decades. And here's what genuinely keeps strategic planners awake at night. We're already approximately 70% of the way down that path. By 2030, barring truly major diplomatic breakthroughs that currently seem unlikely given domestic political dynamics on both sides, the technological split becomes effectively permanent and irreversible. This isn't ultimately about good versus bad in any simple moral sense. It's freedom versus coordination, creative chaos versus disciplined execution, innovation speed versus systemic stability, market mechanisms versus state mandates, bottoms-up entrepreneurship versus top-down planning, distributed decision-making versus centralized direction. Two ancient civilizations, both remarkably sophisticated, both having contributed immeasurably to human progress and knowledge across multiple millennia. Two fundamentally different operating systems for organizing human economic activity and political life, both possessing remarkable strengths that work extraordinarily well in certain contexts, both harboring glaring weaknesses that create serious problems in other contexts. America generates truly extraordinary innovation through intense competition, creates genuine breakthrough technologies through entrepreneurial risk-taking that other systems struggle to match, produces enormous wealth through efficient market mechanisms, protects crucial individual rights through constitutional structures and independent courts, but chronically struggles with long-term infrastructure planning, systematically underinvests in public goods that don't generate immediate private returns, allows economic inequality to grow in ways that increasingly undermine social cohesion and political stability, produces frustrating political gridlock that often prevents necessary policy adaptations. China can mobilize enormous resources rapidly for strategic national priorities, can build world-class infrastructure at speeds that genuinely astonish outside observers, can implement coordinated policies without worrying about opposition parties blocking legislation or courts striking down executive actions, can maintain sustained focus on long-term objectives across multiple leadership transitions, but suppresses individual freedoms in ways that fundamentally offend universal human rights principles, restricts information flows in ways that inevitably limit creativity and truth discovery, creates inherent corruption problems in systems lacking transparent accountability mechanisms, generates deep resentment among populations who understandably want more meaningful voice in decisions affecting their daily lives. Both powerful, both flawed, neither remotely willing to yield on core principles. Neither politically capable of compromising on fundamental questions of system design, neither able to publicly admit that maybe, just possibly, the other system has certain advantages worth honestly acknowledging or partially adapting. The real danger facing humanity isn't war, isn't direct military conflict between nuclear powers who clearly understand that any direct confrontation risks catastrophic escalation beyond anyone's control. The real existential danger is stagnation, is a world that simply stops progressing as rapidly because it fractures completely into competing technological and economic blocks that wastefully duplicate absolutely everything. Two entirely separate supply chains for every category of product, requiring literally double the factories and double the logistics networks and double the inventory sitting idle in warehouses. Two parallel financial systems that don't seamlessly interconnect, requiring constant currency conversions and redundant payment rails that add friction and cost to every international transaction. Two completely separate technology stacks requiring every global company to maintain expensive parallel systems if they want to operate on both sides. If every nation ultimately has to duplicate everything domestically just to be independent, just to ensure that inevitable supply chain disruptions don't leave them dangerously vulnerable, just to guarantee that escalating geopolitical tensions don't suddenly cut off access to goods they depend on, prices rise significantly because powerful economies of scale disappear. Innovation slows substantially because markets fragment and massive development costs can't be efficiently amortized across global sales. Overall progress stalls painfully because vast resources go toward wasteful redundancy rather than genuine advancement. The world doesn't collapse dramatically in this scenario. There's no sudden apocalyptic crisis, no immediate catastrophe that makes headlines and triggers emergency responses. It just gradually stops growing as fast as it otherwise would, just slowly becomes more expensive and less efficient year by year. Living standards improve more slowly than they could. Technologies develop less rapidly than they should. That amazing future that could realistically have arrived by 2030 arrives instead in 2050, delayed by 2 lost decades. That's the real risk facing civilization. Not dramatic destruction or nuclear apocalypse. Entropy. Gradual grinding degradation of the remarkably successful global system that lifted literally billions of people out of poverty and enabled truly unprecedented prosperity through specialization, comparative advantage, and free trade. When rockets explode spectacularly on the launch pad, engineers don't angrily yell at gravity. They don't write op-eds blaming physics for being unfair. They improve the design systematically. They meticulously analyze the failure, rigorously understand exactly what component broke and precisely why it failed, carefully figure out what specifically needs to change, and methodically test again with improvements. This intensifying US-China collision is fundamentally a massive global stress test. An enormous natural experiment revealing hidden weaknesses in systems we had confidently assumed were robust. It doesn't create those weaknesses from nothing. It reveals vulnerabilities that already existed but remained hidden during easier times. Energy dependencies that seemed perfectly manageable during periods of stability and cooperation suddenly become critical national security vulnerabilities during serious conflicts. Digital security gaps that were merely theoretical concerns discussed in academic papers become immediate, practical threats when sophisticated adversaries actively and persistently exploit them. Supply chains ruthlessly optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum cost break catastrophically when major disruptions hit critical nodes that were single points of failure. These shouldn't be endless political arguments where one side ritually blames the other for creating problems. They should be treated as straightforward engineering problems we solve systematically and pragmatically, challenges where we carefully identify failure modes and methodically build in redundancy, where we proactively stress test critical systems before crises hit rather than scrambling reactively during them, where we invest seriously in resilience and robustness even when everything seems fine, because that's precisely when you have the resources and breathing room to build in safety margins. The stress test is happening whether we want it or not. The critical question facing policymakers is whether we learn constructively from it, whether we use this obviously difficult period of tension to build demonstrably better and more resilient systems, or whether we just mindlessly escalate the conflict while dangerously ignoring the underlying brittleness and fragility it keeps exposing. Both nations possess truly unparalleled strengths that the entire world genuinely needs and benefits from. America has remarkable creativity, extraordinary talent that flows from literally every corner of the globe to its world-class universities and innovative companies, vibrant innovation ecosystems in Silicon Valley and Boston and Austin and Seattle, where people with crazy ambitious ideas can realistically find patient capital and experienced mentorship. It has precious freedom to fail, deep cultural acceptance that bankruptcy isn't permanent shameful failure, but valuable learning experience. Institutional systems that genuinely allow people to try audacious things without first asking permission from risk-averse government bureaucracies. It has invaluable openness and tremendous diversity of thought and background that produces unexpected combinations and breakthrough insights. China has impressive discipline, genuine state capacity to rapidly mobilize enormous resources for strategic national priorities, remarkable execution speed on massive infrastructure projects that would literally take multiple decades in democracies with extensive environmental reviews and public comment periods and inevitable litigation. It has tremendous scale advantages. A unified domestic market exceeding 1.4 billion people, providing enormous home field advantages for companies learning and growing before attempting international expansion. It has admirable long-term vision, genuine planning horizons extending well beyond short election cycles, strong institutional memory that effectively persists across leadership changes. It has world-class manufacturing expertise, painstakingly built over decades, invaluable know-how embedded in complex supply chains, and highly skilled workers and relentless process optimization that absolutely cannot be quickly or easily replicated elsewhere. The smartest possible future, the outcome that actually serves humanity's interests, isn't one where one side decisively wins and the other loses, where one system conclusively proves superior and the other collapses, where we get some clean, definitive resolution to the fundamental question of which approach is ultimately better. The smartest achievable future is one where humanity successfully survives this intense rivalry without catastrophically breaking the remarkably successful global system that has enabled unprecedented prosperity and lifted billions from poverty. It's one where we intelligently maintain enough practical integration to preserve the enormous gains from trade and specialization, where we prudently build enough strategic redundancy to handle inevitable disruptions without fragmenting entirely into inefficient autarkic blocks, where we compete intensely and seriously on technology and innovation while simultaneously cooperating pragmatically on climate and pandemics and other truly global challenges that don't respect national borders. Because if we collectively see this as a pure zero-sum game, where China's gain automatically means America's loss and vice versa, where every advance by one side must be immediately countered by the other, where the ultimate goal is absolute dominance rather than stable coexistence, we all lose decades of potential progress. We all sacrifice the innovation and growth that could realistically have happened. We all pay substantially higher prices and grudgingly accept slower overall growth and ultimately live in a world measurably less prosperous than it easily might have been. But if we see this collision as a valuable stress test, as a powerful forcing function revealing where our systems urgently need strengthening, as pressure that can drive genuine innovation in resilience and redundancy and entirely new approaches, we build systems demonstrably stronger than the shocks hitting them. We create robust architectures capable of handling intense rivalry without collapsing into destructive conflict. We develop the sophisticated institutional capacity to compete fiercely and cooperate pragmatically simultaneously, which represents the only realistic path forward in a world that's become far too deeply integrated to fully separate, but remains far too mutually mistrustful to completely integrate. And here's the profound truth nobody says out loud, the deeper reality that gets completely lost in endless technical discussions of tariff rates and trade deficits and technological competition. The rarest resource in this entire conflict isn't rare earth minerals, isn't semiconductor manufacturing capacity, isn't even the talented engineers and brilliant scientists designing next-generation technologies. It's wisdom, genuine judgment knowing when to compete and when to cooperate, real perspective enabling leaders to see beyond the immediate next election or the next 5-year plan to the actual world we're creating for generations who'll inherit our choices. True humility, admitting that maybe your system's weaknesses are real, and the other side's strengths are genuine and sustainable solutions, require mutual learning rather than just asserting dominance. Everything else, minerals, factories, technology, infrastructure, we can mine, rebuild, manufacture given sufficient time and adequate resources. We can find workable substitutes for scarce materials. We can construct entirely new supply chains. We can develop alternative technologies and approaches. We can adapt and adjust and engineer creative ways around physical constraints, because humans have proven remarkably good at solving concrete material problems when properly motivated. But wisdom? That's the genuine bottleneck of the 21st century. That's the real constraint determining whether this intensifying rivalry ultimately pushes humanity forward through productive competition or backward through destructive fragmentation. And here's what makes it genuinely terrifying. Unlike minerals or manufacturing capacity, you cannot simply spend your way to wisdom. You cannot fast-track it with massive funding. You earn it gradually through difficult experience, through making costly mistakes and actually learning from them, through having the courage to honestly admit what you don't know and the discipline to think in time frames substantially longer than your own immediate political survival. That's the real challenge facing both nations and the entire world. Not the geopolitics, not the economics, not even the technology. The wisdom to successfully navigate this dangerous transition without catastrophically breaking everything previous generations worked so hard to build.